in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. It's 11 o'clock. We'll give everyone another minute or two to join us before we get started. Looks like we're waiting on the majority of the group. So like I said, we'll wait another minute or two before we get started. But today we'll be talking about some lessons learned as far as the R2 2013 standard is concerned. Okay, well, I don't want to hold you guys up today, so we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like the majority of the viewers, the attendees, have not joined us yet, but these slides are going to be available on the PJR website within the next 24 hours after the presentation is completed. So if anyone joins us late, you can view the slides to recap. So we'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, good morning, everyone. Today we're covering some lessons learned regarding the R2 2013 standard. Go ahead and start the presentation. My name is Austin Matthews. I am filling in for Scott today. He had a scheduling conflict. I'm the Assistant Program Manager for EHS. Again, filling in for Scott Jones, who you may have encountered on previous webinars. We have some information about PJR here on the screen in case you're looking for contact information if you're a prospective client or a current client who needs to get in touch with someone at PJR. Here's the information. Today we're supposed to have a variety of attendees, including clients, prospective clients, consultants, maybe some auditors as well. So a wide range of attendees. And today's session, it'll be roughly an hour. Essentially, we're going to go over the standard from a high level, really just focusing on some of the areas that we've recently received some clarification on from SERI or find a lot of nonconformities regarding certain areas, so we'd like to try and clarify some of those requirements, answer any specific questions that you may have about the R2 2013 standard, focusing on those lessons learned. As always, the webinar will include a little bit of an overview of the certification process, a little bit about PJR. We'll answer any questions at the end. If you could type those into the webinar side panel, if for those of you who are not familiar with this program, you can type your questions here. At the end of the program, I'll check and see if there are any questions, and if so, we'll answer those as we're able. So go ahead and get started here. A little bit about PJR. PJR is accredited to grant certification for a wide variety of standards. You can see some of those examples on this slide. Obviously, today we're talking about R2. PJR is actually the #1 R2 registrar currently, and the map and this list show examples of countries where PJR currently has certified companies. Most likely, if you're attending this webinar, you're already somewhat familiar with the R2 standard, if not intimately aware of the layout of the standard. So just at a high level, we're looking at the table of contents, essentially, the 13 provisions of R2. We're not going to hit every provision today, and we're not going to discuss or see on the slides every clause or sentence or element of these provisions. We're focusing on, like I said, some of the lessons learned, recent communications with Siri, Siri's spot audit process. Siri has recently taken over the training of R2 auditors, so there have been a lot of lessons learned in the last year or so. So we want to share some of that insight with you guys, answer any questions that you may have, hopefully eliminate some inconsistencies or miscommunications, address these areas where we've seen several nonconformities due to maybe a misunderstanding of these requirements. Just trying to kind of get all on the same page. And again, like I said, answer any questions that you may have today. So we'll go ahead and start with Provision 1, which just at a high level talks about the expectations of the standard. I've also included some information from the Code of Practices here since there's some overlap. But essentially what we want to highlight from Provision 1 is that in terms of documenting the scope for R2 certification, we need to make sure we're including any allowances. But on the subject of allowances, which seems to be a subject of some confusion, I want to go into this in a little more detail. So allowances are only those allowed by the Code of Practices. So the R2 Code of Practices document is very specific as to what allowances exist within the R2 standard, what provisions may or may not be allowed by that allowance. And then again, these specific allowances need to be expressly authorized by the certification body, PJR in this case. So not only do you have to review the Code of Practices allowances to be sure that you are meeting those criteria, the certification bodies such as PJR will then also have to verify that you meet those requirements and approve that allowance in writing via the issuance of a R2 certification, which will indicate the allowance that the organization has been granted. So I listed the 4 allowances here: broker, campus, co-location, and FM processor. We'll go into those in a little bit more detail, but the main takeaway, and we're going to discuss this several times during the webinar today, the main takeaway is that no provisions of the R2 standard can be excluded. If you're familiar with some of the other standards, such as ISO 9001, sometimes there are clauses of the standard that do not apply to your operation, such as design for a 9001 certified company. If there's no design involved, that's a clause that can be excluded. As far as R2 and Siri are concerned, no clauses can actually be excluded. That said, some may be outsourced, or some may be allowed according to one of these allowances, but as we get into this, we'll discuss more how the burden of proof resides on the recycler to demonstrate conformity to these requirements. So even if certain provisions are outsourced, the recycler is still required to ensure the requirements of the standard are being met, even if some other organization is providing those activities or services on the recycler's behalf. If they're pursuing R2 certification, they still need to prove the requirements are being met, obtain any records or due diligence or anything that might be applicable. We'll discuss it more specifically as we look at the different provisions. So the broker allowance, obviously we're talking, if you look at this, the Code of Practices, you can find more detail, but we're talking about a broker, someone who takes legal possession of the electronics or components, but not necessarily physical possession. not going to do any processing. They're orchestrating the movement of those materials. So there won't be any on-site processing to audit against provision 4. 11B, as far as facility closure, may not apply. Storage may not apply, provision 9. And that is on a case-by-case basis. It really depends on what the broker is overseeing specifically. So that's evaluated by the auditor. So provision 9 is also possibly allowed there. Campus allowance, different than maybe some of the other standards. One certificate gets issued for separate addresses. Those separate addresses can be combined into one certificate if those addresses are in the same metropolitan area and under the same management, the same EHS system. So they have to meet those criteria to be considered a campus, and then they can be certified under one certificate. The co-location allowance is a source of some confusion. The co-location allowance is not intended for two companies in the same physical space that both do any form of electronic processing. The co-location allowance is for 2 or more companies in the same physical location where only one of those companies performs electronics processing. As far as SERI defines that, any type of focused material management, if they're sorting and doing some testing, if they're dismantling, if they're refurbishing, reselling materials containing FMs, all of those, any of those types of processing count as electronics processing. So again, the co-location would be for 2 or more companies in the same space where only one of those companies performs electronics processing and the other or others do not. If you have 2 or more companies in the same physical space which both conduct electronics processing, those need to be certified. One can't be certified if the other isn't, because they share that same physical space according to SERI and the R2 standard, but they would be certified separately. So this is sort of a confusing topic for some organizations, or if you're looking to get certified and you have any questions as far as where you may fall in this, you can certainly reach out to PJR. We'll have the contact information for myself and the program manager, Scott Jones, at the end of the presentation. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions or type them in the sidebar and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. The final allowance is the FM processor, which primarily would be an end processor downstream from the recyclers or refurbishers, and in those cases provisions 6 and 8 may not apply in terms of reuse and data destruction, assuming that those have been performed upstream. But again, those are primarily end processors. We're talking smelters, mercury retorters, things like that. So again, any questions as far as allowances are concerned, you can reach out to us at PJR. We can review your organization and talk about what may be applicable. And then again, those allowances would be verified by the auditor, approved in writing by PJR if upon issuance of the certificate. And if the allowance does not fit, then obviously those provisions would in fact be relevant to the audit, to the organization. And we'll talk about the burden of proof for outsourcing as we look at the separate provisions going forward. So the next provision that we're going to look at is provision 3 regarding legal requirements. We have requirements for maintaining, developing a legal compliance plan, including any import or export requirements. We have the fact that this plan should include all relevant EHS and data security requirements, legal and other, should identify what those requirements are, how they apply to the organization. Looking more into the import and export portion, this must be verified whether the countries are OECD or non-OECD. Also a point of confusion, the legality of imports and exports is required to be verified even if the Tier 1 vendor is R2 certified. So we have a lot of companies who think that because they aren't directly exporting, that their Tier 1 vendor for an FM is not located outside of the country, that export or import requirements are not applicable to them. However, this requirement, this provision is relevant to the entire recycling chain. So when we look at provision 5 later on in the webinar, if any of the locations of the downstream vendors are outside of the country of the recycler, those import and export requirements are relevant because we're talking about the recycling chain as a whole. And then again, even if the Tier 1 vendor is R2 certified, the legality of imports and exports have to be verified regardless all the way through end of life. And we'll talk about that again when we look at provision 5. So I just wanted to clarify that part about the R2 certification. And again, with the legal compliance plan, we're also looking for periodic evaluations or audits of compliance to make sure those legal requirements, legal and other requirements that have been identified as applicable to the organization have been monitored and audited to ensure the company is maintaining compliance. It's meeting those requirements, whatever they may be, on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, annual, biannual basis as they're applicable. It goes without saying, I hope, that those audits need to be performed by someone competent, some qualified individual who is familiar with the compliance requirements to be able to effectively assess the organization's compliance to any applicable legal or other requirements. Those are not the same criteria necessarily as an internal auditor, but we do want to make sure whoever's performing that review is qualified in that, again, they're aware, they're well-versed in the compliance requirements that are subject to the organization so that it's a value-added evaluation. Moving on to provision number 4. Some general sections of the provision, again, we're not covering every single clause or line item from the standard, but as a reminder, provision 4 includes housekeeping elements, so making sure that the facility is well maintained, clean, there aren't hazardous materials or broken electronic components all over posing additional hazards to the employees or visitors or anyone who might be working on behalf of the organization. So housekeeping is certainly fair game and should be monitored and planned accordingly. Conducting on an ongoing basis the hazards identifications or assessments, again, that is something that is ongoing as your processes change, as your incoming materials may change. So this isn't a once-and-done review necessarily because over time these things may change. Adding additional shifts or additional processing equipment, again, receiving different types of focus materials or electronics than before may pose additional hazards or environmental aspects to be on the lookout for. Similarly, an emergency response plan is something that should be maintained, something that should be reviewed or updated as needed as changes occur. Have additional shifts been included in the emergency plan? The emergency drill schedule have the addition of any processing equipment or changes to the facility, made any changes necessary to the existing plan? Have the drills or tests that have been conducted identified any needs for changes? So again, an emergency response plan shouldn't be created once and never looked at again. If I could just go back to provision 4, one other thing I wanted to mention in terms of monitoring of the hazards, the environmental aspects, or any operational controls that are deemed required accordingly, we also want to keep in mind things like environmental or health and safety monitoring that may be required. For recycling operations, we often see the need to do some air monitoring depending on the processing equipment, the types of FMs, any permits that the facility may have. So there may be some dust sampling, some biomonitoring required, such as blood testing depending on the materials that are being processed, heavy metals or wipe sampling, stormwater sampling, again, depending on the permits that are in place at the facility, noise sampling, depending on the processing equipment utilized and the PELs that may have been tested and resulted in the past. Those can dictate the monitoring that is required. A respirator program may be required depending on the air monitoring results. Especially in CRT processing facilities, we see additional monitoring required, but even if you're not processing CRTs necessarily, you may have some monitoring requirements that are relevant, and that is fair game for provision 4 as well, to make sure that the controls are effective. The monitoring results will indicate if the controls are effective in protecting the employees or the physical environment based on the hazards that have been identified within the management system. Provision 5 regarding focus materials, the first part of the provision talks about analyzing, planning, updating as necessary, how those FMs are managed, specifically on-site and within the recycling chain. So having a plan means that this is documented. So the auditor is looking for some kind of list or spreadsheet or flow diagram or some combination of documents, depending on what makes sense for your organization, as to the recycling chain. What happens to the material while the FMs are on site? How are they being processed? How are they being managed? But also, where are they going when they leave your facility? Each location, every place or organization that is taking possession or putting hands on those equipment or components should be accounted for. The company name, the location, the processing methods, all of that should be planned out, meaning that the organization is aware of what is happening to the materials, as that ties back into the other downstream due diligence requirements that we'll talk about shortly. So showing evidence of a plan means that that is documented. The auditor needs to see where those materials are going to be able to confirm the due diligence information, the legal import-export information, the tracking throughput information, some other requirements of the standard as well, just a few examples. But we're looking for the entire recycling chain from your facility through end of life. This also includes non-FMs to the first tier. You don't have to go further than that, but where are those non-FMs going as well? In terms of the due diligence, again, this is not all of the clauses within the provision or all of the requirements within the provision. We're just focusing on a select few. For non-R2 certified Tier 1 vendors, we're looking for evidence of a documented EHS and legal system. So at a minimum, you can see here, at a minimum, we're looking for the components of Provision 3 and 4. The due diligence requirements for Provision 5 go beyond just a downstream vendor survey. That is not sufficient evidence of these different criteria listed in Provision 5E. In terms of evidence of an EHS and legal system, we may be looking for a list of legal and other requirements, evidence of compliance audits, the hazards that are identified via some sort of risk assessment, procedures that may be related to high-risk processes, any OSHA required programs depending on the processing methods and equipment used, an emergency response plan, how copies of any permits, looking at the next clause, complying with all applicable environmental health and safety legal requirements, maintaining a current list of any permits and copies of each. So this sort of this relates to provision 3 as well, but in terms of the downstream due diligence, okay, they have a system. They're also maintaining compliance with those requirements that are applicable to their facility, just as you, as a recycler or an R2 certified organization, would be required to do. Jumping down a little bit, looking for evidence of conformance to tracking throughput requirements. You're looking for evidence that your Tier 1 vendor is meeting all of these requirements, and are they doing the same subsequently? Are they maintaining tracking throughput records that are going to help you meet your requirements to R2 to demonstrate conformance to those requirements? Because again, when we're talking about outsourcing or not being able to exclude any provisions, the R2 certified recycler is required to demonstrate records of conformance throughout the entire recycling chain, since that is relevant to the standard. As far as tracking throughput is concerned, if the Tier 1 vendor is R2 certified, we don't need to verify the tracking throughput records, meaning we don't need copies of BOLs or other commercially accepted documentation through end of life to establish that downstream flow and that tracking throughput methodology. However, if they're not R2 certified, we do require that. And then the last example on this slide, physical security all the way down the recycling chain, relevant to the appropriate security level. So obviously, high-value materials or data-bearing media, the security expectations would be more significant. The expectations for downstream vendors also is that this information is confirmed on an annual basis. So before you're shipping electronics containing FMs, components containing FMs, the expectation is that the downstream vendor and their subsequent tiers, the recycling chain, will be vetted and approved prior to shipment of those materials. That said, it's not a once and done requirement. You should be reviewing and updating and reconfirming all of that information on at least an annual basis to ensure the downstream is still the same, they continue to meet all of those requirements according to R2, that you have updated documentation to show an auditor or SERI if they're conducting a spot audit that your downstream vendors are conforming to the requirements of R2 on your behalf, because again, you're outsourcing those requirements. You're not excluding those provisions. You're just outsourcing the work. 5G talks about, I mentioned this earlier, if you're using an R2 certified downstream vendor as in an R2 certified Tier 1 vendor, the due diligence requirements are streamlined. So if we look at 5E1, we're talking about conformance to an FM plan, some other requirements. So essentially confirming that they are in fact R2 certified, their certificate is in good standing, which would go beyond getting a copy of their certificate. SERI's website has recently changed so that not only can you look up a recycler, a certified recycler, you can also check their list of recent changes. You can see certificates that have been suspended, certificates that have been revoked, companies that have voluntarily withdrawn certification, things like that. So a printed certificate doesn't expire for 3 years. However, just because you have a copy of the certificate in hand doesn't mean that that company hasn't been suspended for not closing out nonconformities or has decided not to continue with R2. If you can't substantiate their continued R2 certification, then those additional due diligence requirements would kick in. If they're no longer R2 certified, all those other elements of the provision now need to be verified when maybe previously they hadn't been, because the company had been R2 certified when initially approved or at the time of your last annual review. The other requirement is 5E6, which relates to tracking throughput, so confirming that the downstream flow is as described. Those commercially acceptable documents would be available if needed, or for sampling purposes, for record-keeping purposes, and that the downstream flow, where the material is actually going, if you look at those shipping documents, matches that which has been described as their downstream flow, their recycling chain, for the purposes of your focus material plan, and several other requirements within the standard. And that would be all that's required for that initial approval and those annual audits for an R2 certified vendor, making sure their R2 certification is in good standing, their focus material plan continues to meet the requirements of your focus material plan, your processing requirements in terms of avoiding landfill or waste energy, making sure that anything that can be reused or repaired is in fact reused and repaired, all of those types of things, and that the tracking throughput requirements continue to be met. Provision 6 talks about reuse, repair, refurbishing, all of those requirements to make sure that anything that could potentially be reused instead of being recycled is captured accordingly. This provision continues to be a source of confusion. Several nonconformities, several recent explanations from Siri have illuminated, like I said, some potential misunderstandings here. So we definitely want to spend a couple minutes on this provision. As you are likely already aware, Provision 6 breaks down equipment into 3 categories: tested for full function, R2 ready for reuse; tested for key functions, R2 ready for resale; and or evaluated and non-function, R2 ready for repair. So we'll look at each of those in more detail. But as a whole, I just want to talk about the fact that, going back to the fact that we can't outsource, we can't exclude any of these requirements. So even if this repair or refurbishment or resale work gets outsourced, we still need all of the records to demonstrate conformance as an R2 recycler come your R2 or Siri audits. If PJR comes in to audit you, we're going to be looking for those records, even if that work is outsourced for all of the equipment. So we'll circle back around to that as we look at the different criteria, but as a reminder, we're not excluding these requirements, with the exception of the FM processor allowance, which would confirm that nothing coming in to the facility has any reuse or repair potential any longer, because you're really end of life at that point. Other than that, this requirement is not excluded. So whether it's outsourced or done in-house or some combination of the two, we're going to be looking for evidence that the outsourced company is meeting the requirements of R2 on the behalf of the R2 certified recycler. The first category, tested for full function, R2 ready for reuse, constitutes equipment that is almost brand new. This is a little bit subjective potentially here, but essentially this is equipment that has all of the necessary components, not just key functions working properly, but full functionality tested. There is nothing that's not working. If it requires legally licensed software or specific drivers, those are installed. A charger, a battery, anything required for the full operation of this equipment has to be included. No major cosmetic defects, almost as if it were bought in a store. Obviously, this excludes anything that is unopened in original packaging that is addressed separately within the provision. So obviously, this is open material, but beyond that, everything is accounted for. Full functionality, any required components or accessories, operating software, all of that stuff is included. So for Provision 6, we're looking for testing methods for all of that functionality and any components that would be required. And we're looking for this verbiage to be used prior to shipping the equipment. One of these 3 categories, we're looking for that exact verbiage to be included in the shipment, whether it's on the invoice or the shipping documentation or somehow on the device itself in a way that's not going to disappear like a post-it note or something, but looking for those specific equipment or component items to be identified as one of these 3 categories. Sorry, went a little too fast there. A written quality assurance plan is another requirement of this provision, unless the recycler is also certified to ISO 9001 or RIOS, which include the same elements of the quality assurance plan. When we talk about a quality assurance plan, we're talking about the testing criteria that have been identified for all the different types of material and the functionality requirements to be considered full functionality in this full function category. Work instructions to address any relevant responsibilities, testing criteria, cosmetic grading, all of those things, that has been planned out for the purposes of referencing for employees, training, to show that there is a plan in place for how those units will be tested, categorized, subsequently repaired and refurbished if possible, all of that stuff. On the other hand of that plan of what will be implemented, we're also looking for the records. So maintaining records of the testing outputs, the results, the testing methods that you've identified within your quality plan, where are the records to show that the equipment was tested accordingly and what the outcome or outcomes of those tests were for each piece of equipment. So this is an area that has recently been clarified from SERI. When we're talking about potentially outsourcing some of this testing, again, since it's not excluded, we need those records to substantiate the testing that has been performed for each of those items. So if the testing itself is outsourced, we're looking for those records for each piece of equipment or component, the testing output, the results of the testing performed. Those records need to be maintained whether you're doing that in-house or you're outsourcing that activity. If the testing is being outsourced, we also need to see some sort of sorting or evaluation process at the original recycler as evidence of how that material is being assessed. How is the organization going to know what to send to the refurbisher or send to the next tier to outsource that testing and refurbishing to? There needs to be some sorting evaluation going on to substantiate what is being sent on, what is maybe being kept within the facility to go for dismantling. You can't send everything out as, the third category, non-functioning. if none of it has been evaluated, some sort of sorting process or evaluation process, even if it's at a high level, there needs to be evidence of that, even if the provision, the remainder of the provision as far as testing and repair is outsourced to another vendor. We'll talk about outsourcing a little bit later in this provision, but I wanted to talk about that while we were looking at the record requirements specifically. We have a product return plan requirement. Again, for this category of full functionality, things need to be clean, free of major cosmetic defects, and any required components are included. Similarly, for key function category, ready for resale, obviously we're still testing. We're confirming that the components, the equipment are in working order, but we're focusing only on key functions now at this point. So full functionality being the first category, we're looking at the second, which is key functions. The key functions of the equipment need to be working, and any secondary functions do not need to be functional. If we're looking at a cell phone, examples of secondary functions may be the SD card slot, a stylus if it has one included originally with the phone, or it's included but it doesn't work. The camera on a cell phone maybe would be a secondary function. If we're looking at a laptop, other examples may be the webcam, not necessarily required, not a key function of the laptop. If the keys work, the computer itself can be utilized, but the webcam is not working. Similarly, maybe the CD or DVD drive is not functional, but again, the key functions of the laptop are in good working order and have been tested for functionality. The standard is very specific as to disclosing any functionality that is not working. So that requirement is still in place even if secondary functions are not working. We want to share those results to make sure that it meets the requirements of the buyer. Disclosing any defects or cosmetic issues, all of that needs to be communicated. Same requirements as far as the quality assurance plan, records. Again, here we see the requirement to disclose. If you're selling something on eBay, this would be included in the listing itself, or whatever methodology is being used to advertise these items. It has to be clearly communicated. And again, that relates to meeting the requirements of the vendor, still having a product return plan, all things we talked about for the full functionality category. Evaluated and non-function R2 ready for repair category. This is a little bit of a different animal in terms of the refurbishing or the repair work not being done in-house or outside of the capability of the recycler. It may be considered in this category where it could be repaired, you just don't have the capability of doing it in-house. So again, we're talking about outsourcing here. This would, equipment or components in this category would not be sold on eBay because you can't verify that the recipient vendor or the buyer meets the requirement of the provision once we get to that part. So as a reminder, we're not to see these types of equipment or components on eBay or some similar sale platform. We also want to be careful as far as our verbiage on eBay or a similar sales platform so as not to mislead buyers or auditors into thinking that you are selling ready for repair items on eBay. So obviously eBay has some criteria as to what the listings have to contain, your options for the condition, things like that. That is understood, but we'll talk a little bit more about maybe some misleading verbiage to avoid. Again, we're looking at a quality assurance plan to see what the tech cut line is, what we're looking at here, what's going to make sense to be repaired, even if it can't be done in-house, the testing, the sorting, the evaluation that's done to identify what belongs in this category, the pricing of units accordingly, all of that stuff in the quality assurance plan, any procedures or work instructions associated with meeting these requirements. So here's the portion where we talk about all the requirements the buyer needs to meet, hence the requirement to not utilize eBay. You can verify these requirements through a combination of different things. You can audit the buyer, you can use contractual agreements, you can get records of tracking throughput, other sorts of records. You can audit those processes. Either way, the electronics need to go to either an R2 certified recycler, and then you would circle back to your downstream due diligence requirements, or somehow verify that the recipient vendor meets the requirements of provision 6 in terms of reselling, repairing. Again, if you're outsourcing this work, you still have to meet the requirements of R2. So to whomever the work is being outsourced, you need to have records, you need to have performed this verification that they would meet the requirements of R2 on your behalf. And then for anything that can't be repaired, what are they doing with those FMs? Again, making sure they meet the requirements of Provision 5, Provision 6, the R2 standard on your behalf. And again, as always, making sure that those equipment or components meet the requirements of the vendor, the buyer. Downstream due diligence is not required for sale of items under the full function or key function category, as well as anything that's brand new in the original packaging. We talked about that a little bit before. So again, just to circle back to the descriptions here, we want to make sure that the material is not being misrepresented, that the R2 certification itself isn't being misrepresented. So on sites like eBay, we want to make sure we're avoiding terminology like sold as is, for parts only, pulled from a working environment. All of those are red flags that tend to align more with that non-functioning ready for repair category, or imply that the testing performed, if any, does not meet the requirements of R2. So these are some red flags for auditors, for Siri, for your own knowledge of maybe some things to avoid. If you have verbiage like this in your listings, you want to reevaluate how you're describing the functionality or the condition of that equipment. This could come up in an audit if it has not already. Moving right along, we're looking at provision 7 related to tracking throughput. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but I did want to cover Siri's, a sort of definition of commercially accepted documentation, or as auditors, what we're looking for related to tracking throughput. When we read the standard and it says commercially accepted documentation, what does that mean to us? So it can mean a lot of things, but it does not mean some sort of informal, self-generated record or report. We're looking for commercially accepted records, things like records of destruction, invoices for shipments, bills of lading, export records, permits or approval documentation, waste manifests, things like that. All of the required fields are filled in, the driver, the receiver, whoever has signed it, that those are commercially accepted documentation that's going to hold water as far as your R2 audit is concerned. The R2 2013 version of the standard does require that a recycler who is certified to R2 shares this information as to the downstream vendor, the location, anything within the recycling chain for FMs that pass through the recycler's facility, to share that information to, with a customer if it's requested. This was not necessarily included in the verbiage of the previous version of the standard with R2 2008, and this proved an issue as far as meeting the downstream due diligence requirements. How could you confirm as a recycler where your material was going to pass your R2 audit when the downstream vendor wouldn't share that with you? So this language a bit stronger was added to the 2013 version of the standard to ensure that that information is shared. Perhaps you need to deal with the intellectual property controls, maybe sign an NDA or something similar, but once that is done, you are required to share that information. A mass balance is not required when we're talking about tracking throughput, transfers of equipment, but an auditor is looking to confirm through the volume records that you maintain that the material isn't being diverted. It is being managed as described in the focus material plan, looking at what's going on site, the entire recycling chain, where the FMs are going. Again, that material is going where you say it's going. The volumes roughly add up. Nothing seems to be going missing, or the vast majority of the electronics going somewhere that hasn't been disclosed. Tracking throughput similarly is the tool that you use to vet your downstream vendors to confirm the same, that your material is being sent to the subsequent tiers that they're identifying for you, and this tracking throughput information helps you confirm that that is in fact where your material is going and how it's being processed. Data destruction, not going to cover too much for this one as well, but focusing on, again, the idea of outsourcing this requirement. If it's being outsourced, actually we're going to get to that on the next slide, I believe. So just at a high level, making sure that the process itself is being validated by an independent party. Often we see only the wiping results being validated, but this requirement relates to the process as a whole. The procedures are being followed. The responsible employees have had the required training. The physical destruction is also being validated. All of that stuff, all of the elements of Provision 8 are being validated. So the process as a whole, not just the wiping. Something to consider if your process does not already address this. Quality controls, security controls, records of data destruction, all required within the provision. And again, those records relate to the data destruction even if it's being outsourced. So if it's handled by a downstream vendor, again, you're still maintaining responsibility for that data, for the handling of those focus materials. So the tracking, the security level as it's being transported, we talked about this a little bit before. If it's still containing data, what additional security methodologies are put in place, whether you're setting up the transport or the downstream vendor is? How is that media being secured until the data has been removed? Making sure that the downstream vendor you're utilizing to outsource the data destruction meets all of the requirements of Provision 8, because again, they're processing that material on your behalf as the R2 certified recycler. And we want to make sure we're addressing all media types and getting records to show the output, the results of those data destruction activities that are being performed. So if you are outsourcing Provision 8 to a downstream vendor, when we're conducting your audits, we're going to still be looking for all of the same evidence that we would if it was being done on site. How did you confirm that the data destruction employees are trained meeting the requirements of Provision 8? Where are the validation records, the procedures relevant to that process? All of that, how have you made sure those elements are meeting the requirements of Provision 8? You may not necessarily need a copy of all of those things, but some type of process to confirm, to vet the vendor against that Provision 8, all of those Provision 8 requirements. And then the output records as far as the record-keeping requirements are concerned. And we also want to make sure we're addressing all media types. We see a lot of hard drives, obviously, But some of the other types of media, flash drives, SD or SIM cards for phones or cameras, internal memory on some of the devices beyond just the SD card or SIM card, fax machine, carbon imprints, CD-ROMs, floppy disks. There's a whole host of different types of media, and they may be few and far between, potentially depending on the material that's coming into your facility, but making sure that the employees are trained to recognize those materials if they come in the door, and that there are data destruction methodologies in place to account for those. Obviously, an industrial shredder that you're using for copiers or printers is not going to cut it for a little SIM card or a USB drive, because they're going to most likely be too small to be processed by that equipment. So looking for evidence that all media has been addressed. And these requirements extend to, again, your outsourced vendor. Even if they're R2 certified, you're going to need those records to show that the material has been destroyed according to the requirements of Provision 8. We're almost done. I'll try and get through the remainder of this fairly quickly so we have a couple minutes for questions. Sorry, it looks like we're going to go over. Provision 11 in terms of insurance and the closure plan, what we want to highlight here is that pollution coverage is assumed required by default. It's automatically assumed required for a recycler unless the recycler can prove otherwise. So we're looking for not just a informal approval from the insurance company, who may or may not be qualified to make that determination. They may not be familiar with the requirements or with the recycling industry. That may not be sufficient. You're looking for, as an example, a risk assessment, an environmental risk assessment conducted by a qualified professional. One example would be a certified hazardous materials manager. That is not the only sort of individual that would meet those requirements. I just put that in there as some type of example to kind of get the ball rolling. But it has to be someone who's familiar with the industry and competent and qualified to make that determination. So unless documented evidence of that can be provided to the auditor, pollution coverage is required. It's generally excluded from a general liability coverage, so if you're not sure, take a close look at what your insurance coverage includes, and then if you need additional coverage to cover those pollution requirements, you can go ahead and obtain that. Again, you will see this in audits if it's not already contained. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the closure plan. So I just wanted to note on the topic of pollution insurance, currently SERI does not accept pollution insurance as a way of covering closure costs. So again, in terms of the closure plan, there's several specific requirements within the provision, but we want to make sure that sufficient financial instruments are in place to cover those closure costs that have been identified. The plan for closure of the facility, again, required by Provision 8, allocated to an independent party, not the management representative or someone who works for the company, with financial instruments sufficient to cover all of the closure costs that have been identified within the closure plan. The last topic I want to cover is advertising the R2 certification. These requirements are found in the Code of Practices as well as PJR's Pro 3 procedure. It's taken from the Code of Practices. The Pro 3 procedure can be obtained from PJR directly. It houses not only the R2 Code of Practices advertising requirements, but all of the advertising requirements for the different certification bodies, or PJR as a registrar, as a certification body, all of the requirements for other standards as well. So you can find them all in one place with the Pro 3 to make sure you're advertising in line with those criteria, but this specifically, these R2 requirements came directly from the Code of Practices. In terms of if you have multiple locations and they're not all certified, being very careful not to mislead anyone really into thinking that all of the locations are certified. So in using the logo and using the verbiage R2 certified or anything along those lines, we need to make sure we're clarifying that. And the website, business cards, brochures, different types of advertising are all fair game for these audits, to be spot checking that this is appropriate, and if it's found not to be appropriate, nonconformities will be issued, revisions will be required. If revisions are not made, you could see a suspension or even a revocation eventually of certification, so that this is not being misled. The Code of Practices is required to be, the requirements of the Code of Practices are required to be met. Similarly, if the scope of certification doesn't include all activities within a facility, we need to be careful again how we're advertising as far as that certification. We can't imply that all of the processes are certified when in fact they're not. One common error we find is that the R2 logo is either outdated or it's not hyperlinked to Siri's website. So obviously I forgot to update my slide. The website is now Siri's, and I will correct this before it gets posted to the website, PJR's website for viewing. I will make sure I get that corrected. But in the Code of Practices NPro 3, the exact link is included. Anytime the logo is used, it needs to be hyperlinked directly to the website. You can't alter the logos, and obviously if you're suspended, withdraw certification, have your certification revoked, you need to stop advertising the R2 certification altogether. Most of you are likely already familiar with the certification process, so I will skim through this since I'm running over on time. I do apologize for running a little bit over. I wanted to cover quite a bit of material. If you're pursuing initial certification, we're looking at a stage 1 audit, a document review to ensure the framework is in place, the requirements of the standard have been identified and implemented from a documentation perspective, that you're ready to move on to stage 2, which includes the review of the implementation of those requirements. At stage 1, you identify what's required, you have your documentation in place, you've begun implementation or have already implemented. Stage 2 focuses on how effective that implementation was, and are you subsequently meeting the requirements of the standard. Any nonconformities identified at stage 2 need to be resolved before a certificate could be issued. The certificate is good for 3 years once issued. You have surveillance audits at least once a year. You could go to semi-annual with 2 audits a year if you prefer. And that is a partial system audit. We don't cover every single process within the scope of those audits. At the recertification on the 3rd year to reissue a certificate, we have a 3-year cycle. The recertification audit will be a full system audit, just as the stage 2 is a full system audit. We cover all of the processes, issue a new certificate that's good for 3 years, and we start again with the surveillance audits. You don't have to go through the stage 1 process again unless your certification is revoked at some point for some reason. Okay. If you haven't already typed your questions in the sidebar, now would be the time to do that. I'm going to check in a moment to see if we have any questions to answer before we sign off here. In the meantime, I'm going to leave this information up. It's our contact information. Again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the Assistant Program Manager, and I can be contacted here. And the EHS Program Manager, Scott Jones, can also be contacted with any technical questions. If you're looking for a quote, you can contact our sales department directly. Not sure why it's giving me a hard time. I want to check and see if we have any questions. Let's see. Okay. I'm having a hard time understanding some of these questions, so if it's not showing up here or I don't answer your question, feel free to get in touch with me offline. Some feedback on the line. I'm not sure what that question is referencing, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that one. Get in touch with me offline, and I can try and assist there. Can you summarize a general list of what documentation should be requested for the downstream vendors of R2 companies? Let's see. So I can't give you an exact list, and I would definitely encourage you to look at the specific verbiage in the standard. Due to time constraints, I'm not going to pull that up. But if you're talking about a Tier 1 vendor who is R2 certified, you're looking for their certificate, their FM plan, and confirming that the R2 certification is in good standing. Again, we talked about series website. And then for the tracking throughput, it may be a sampling of tracking throughput records such as the commercially acceptable shipping records we talked about, evidence of meeting that tracking throughput provision. That's all that's required for R2 certified vendors in terms of vetting them to send the material. So we're looking at 5E1, which is the FM plan, the R2 certification, 5E6, which is the tracking throughput provision, and the only other thing would be if there are any imports or exports from provision 3, we'd be looking for evidence of the legality of all of those shipments. Permits or approval or regulations that verify the import or export of those specific materials to those specific countries is legal. If you are talking about anything under provision 6 or 8 or any additional outsourcing, you would look at those provisions as well for additional requirements for your approval process. If I haven't answered your question in full, again, please feel free to reach out to me. If you are found to not have a hyperlink to your to series website on the R2 logo, it could generally be, oops, I'm getting all mixed up here. How do I make this bigger? Let's see. Sorry guys, bear with me. Not having the R2 logo, so in essence it could be a minor. However, Siri will require revision and evidence of that revision, so while it could potentially be a minor, sometimes it's issued as a major to require that evidence of closure, evidence that it has been resolved. If we find it via the executive committee or some other process other than your audit or Siri reports it to us, we do require evidence that it has been resolved. So if it's a repeat finding, it would certainly be a major. It could otherwise most likely be written as a minor, but we would also require evidence that you have subsequently hyperlinked the requirement. If it's a recertification audit or there's a concern about it not being resolved, could potentially be written as a major as well. In terms of effective testing method, I can't really answer that. That's such a broad definition, and it really depends on the specific type of equipment we're looking at here. So I'd have to take that question on a case-by-case basis, or Siri is a great resource as well if you have specific questions or concerns. Effective testing methods, it depends again on the equipment type. Often powering up to BIOS would not be an effective testing method for full functionality, depending on the equipment type, because it often doesn't test for every function of the piece of equipment, or if it doesn't have an operating system, it's limited in what it checks. So in general, it really varies by piece of equipment or component types. The list of the FMs can be found within the standard. There's sections for definitions. Let's see, it's in several portions of the standard. Let me see if I can quickly find that for you. Okay, so I would recommend just going to the end of the standard where it contains the definitions and look up the definition of the focus material, and you can find the list of FMs there. Some of these are incomplete questions. I apologize. I'm not trying to skip anyone's question, but if it's not enough information for me to answer, I can't help much. Okay, so we have a question. I heard that Siri has allowed certain facilities to bypass Provision 5 due diligence requirements for downstream vendors that it has no control over their selection. Has Siri issued any additional guidance or information on whether this will continue to be the case? So in some cases, recyclers have maybe one customer, maybe it's a large company like Samsung or T-Mobile, just as examples, and they dictate the downstream flow where the recycler is allowed to send that material. So to an extent, this is somewhat subjective. I would have to check if Siri has issued anything formally. I could certainly check on that if you want to get with me offline. But certainly in those cases, the downstream due diligence requirements are limited. If you have no say over where that material goes, if you're contractually obligated, then there's not a whole lot you can do. That would not apply, obviously, to any other focus materials you have that aren't covered by those contractual requirements. And if they change at any point, you have to be ready to step in and implement those due diligence requirements. What source can I use to find out if we can ship different countries like Hungary, for example? So we don't have any specific websites that we can share. Siri has recently begun compiling on their website different resources to help investigate or look into the legal requirements and the import-export requirements. So I would suggest as a starting point reviewing the Siri website. There's a lot of helpful information on there. And as a registrar, we have to be careful not to consult, so we can't necessarily give you a list. If you sell untested hard drives to an R2 recycler, is that considered outsourcing? Yes, it absolutely is. If you are not conducting the testing or the resale or the refurbishing or any part of that, and it's not something covered by an allowance, since you can't exclude any requirements, that is considered outsourcing. In terms of testing key functions for reuse, what would be considered an effective test method? Again, this isn't something that we can prescribe. Again, there are so many different publications out there, PACE guidance, different information on the Siri website. I addressed this question or a similar question a little bit earlier on as far as it really depending on the type of equipment. For downstream auditing, is there a certain point when you can no longer use desktop audits and they must be done on site? I believe that, I think it's the guidance document at the end or towards the end of the document contains a flow diagram to help differentiate for clients when an on-site audit or an off-site audit may be sufficient. From our perspective, we don't have a black and white line. We would be looking for evidence that the requirements of Provision 5 were met. So if you're not able to get the documentation from the vendor, you may consider going on site to conduct more of an audit to see what they have in place. Maybe they won't give you copies of documents, but you can review them while you're on site, things like that. So it's sort of at the discretion of the recycler. It looks like those are all of the questions. I know we went 15 minutes over, and again, I do apologize for that, but the slides will be available on PJR's website. You can reach out to PJR or look under previously recorded webinars on the PJR website, and these slides will be available. You can also obtain a copy of the recording, including the audio, by contacting PJR. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, sorry we went over. Looks like we have one more question. So if I export, should I ask every vendor if they are R2 certified? If you export, it does not matter. If anyone within your recycling chain exports, it doesn't matter whether R2 certified or not. The legality of those exports needs to be verified. We covered that under Provision 3. So you can certainly ask whether or not they're R2 certified in terms of the Provision 5 downstream due diligence requirements, but for export requirements, it really doesn't make a difference. You're going to have to obtain evidence that those exports are legal, whether they're R2 certified or not. Okay, now that looks like all the questions. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Feel free to contact us if you have any additional questions. Have a great day.